by Jack London. Chapter 1, Into the Primitive. Buck did not read the newspaper, or he would have known the trouble was brewing. And it was brewing for every strong dog with warm and long hair on the Pacific coast, from Puget Sound to San Diego. Trouble was brewing because men groping in the Arctic darkness had found a yellow metal. Steamships and transport companies were advertising the find, and thousands of men were rushing to the Northland. These men wanted dogs, and the dogs they wanted were heavy dogs with strong muscle for working and with furry coats to protect them from the frost. Buck lived in a big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. Judge Miller's place, it was called. It stood back from the road, half hidden along the trees. Glimpses could be caught through the trees of the wild, cool verandas that ran around all four sides of the house. The house was approached by a gravel driveway, which wound through wide lawns and under the connecting boughs of tall poplar trees. At the rear, things were even more spacious than at the front. There were great stables where dozens of grooms and boys worked. There were rows of vine-covered servants' cottages, an orderly cluster of small buildings, large grape arbors, green pastures, orchards, and berry patches. Then there was the pumping plant for the well, and the big cement tank where the Judge Miller's boys took their morning swim and kept cool in the hot afternoon. And over the great kingdom Buck ruled. Here he was born and here he had lived the 4 years of his life. It was true, there were other dogs. There had to be other dogs on such a vast place as this, but they did not count. They came and went. Some of them lived in crowded kennels, others lived unseen in the darkness of the house's inner rooms, like Toots, the Japanese pug, and Isabel, the Mexican hairless, strange creatures that rarely put their nose out of the door or set their feet on the ground. On the other hand, there were the fox terriers, at least 20 of them. The terriers barked frighteningly, promising at Toots and Isabel, who looked out the windows at them, protected by a small army of housewives with brooms and mops. But Buck was neither house dog nor kennel dog. The whole kingdom was his. He plunged into the swimming tank and went hunting with the judge's sons. He escorted Molly and Alice, the judge's daughters, on a long twilight or early morning rambles. On wintry nights he lay at the judge's feet before the roaring fire in the house's library. He carried the judge's grandsons on his back or rolled them in the grass and guarded them through wild adventures down to the fountain and into the stable yard and even beyond, where the padlocks and the berry patches were. He walked among the terriers in a stiff and haughty way, and Toots and Isabel he totally ignored, for he was a king. King over all creepy, crawly, flying things at Judge Miller's place, humans included. His father, Elmo, a huge St. Bernard, had been the judge's loyal companion, and Buck seemed likely to follow in his father's way. Buck was not so large. He weighed only 140 pounds, for his mother, Shep, had been a shepherd. Nevertheless, 140 pounds, along with a dignified manner that came from good living and widespread respect, enabled him to carry himself like a king. During the 4 years since his puppyhood, he had lived the life of a stately nobleman. He was proud, even a bit arrogant, and as a country gentleman sometimes becomes because of their isolation. But he had saved himself by not becoming merely a spoiled house dog. Hunting and other outdoor pleasures had kept down the fat and hardened his muscles, and the love for swimming had strengthened him and kept him healthy. This was the kind of dog Buck was in the fall of 1897, when the Klondike strike dragged men from all the world into the frozen north. But Buck did not read the newspapers, nor did he know that Manuel, one of the gardener's helpers, was a person that he should not trust. Manuel had one overpowering sin. He loved to play Chinese lottery. Also in his gambling, he had one overpowering weakness, faith in the system. And this made his fate certain. For to play a system requires money, and while the wages of a gardener's helper did not cover the needs of a wife and several children. On the night of Manuel's betrayal, the gardener was at a meeting of the Raisin Growers Association, and the boys were busy organizing an athletic club. No one saw Manuel and Buck go off through the orchard. Buck thought they were just taking a walk, except for one man. No one saw Manuel and Buck arrive at the little train station known as College Park. This man talked with Manuel, and the money clinked between them. "You might have wrapped up the goods before you delivered 'em," the stranger said gruffly. Manuel wound 2 loops of stout rope around Buck's neck under his collar. "Twist it, and you'll choke 'em aplenty," said Manuel, and the stranger grunted in agreement. Buck had accepted the rope with quiet dignity. To be sure, it was an action that he was not used to, but he had learned to trust in men that he knew and to give them credit for greater wisdom than his own. He growled, however, when the end of the ropes were placed in the stranger's hand. He had merely hinted at his dislike in his pride, believing that a hint was all that was needed. But to his surprise, the rope had tightened around his neck, shutting off his breath. In quick rage, he sprang at the man, who met him halfway, and the man grabbed him close by the throat and with a quick twist threw him over on his back. Then the rope tightened without mercy, and Buck struggled in fury, his tongue hanging out in his mouth and his great chest panting helplessly. Never in all of his life had he been treated so badly, and never in his life had he been so angry. But his strength drained away and his eyes grew glassy. By the time the train stopped and the 2 men threw him into a baggage car, he knew nothing. The next he knew, he was dimly aware that his tongue was hurting and that he was being jolted along in some kind of car. The shriek of the locomotive whistle told him where he was. He was traveling too often with the judge not to know the sensation of riding in a baggage car. He opened his eyes, and into them came the fury of a kidnapped king. The man sprang for Buck's throat, but Buck was too quick. His jaws closed on his hand and did not relax until his senses were once more choked out of him. "Yep, it has fits," the man said, holding his wounded hand from the baggage men, who had been attracted by the sound of the struggle. "I'm taking him up to the San Francisco for the boss, a top-notch doctor that thinks he can cure him." Later, in a little back shed of the saloon in San Francisco waterfront, the man talked about the night's ride. "All I get is $50, he grumbled. "I wouldn't do it again for 1,000 cold cash." His hand was wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, and the right trouser leg was ripped from knee to ankle. "How much the other punk get?" the saloon keeper demanded. "100, was the reply. "He wouldn't take a cent less, so help me." "Then that makes 150, the saloon keeper added. "He's worth it, or I'm a squarehead." The kidnapper undid the bloody wrappings and looked at his injured hand. "If I don't get rabies, it's because you were born to hang," laughed the saloon keeper. "Here, lend me a hand before you leave," he added, dazed, suffering unbearable pain from throat and tongue, with the life half choked out of him. Buck tried to face his torturers, but he was thrown back and down, choked again and again, until the men at last finished filing the heavy brass collar off his neck. Then the rope was removed, and he was thrown into a wooden crate that was like a cage. There he lay for the rest of the weary night, nursing his anger and wounded pride. He would not understand what it all meant. Why did these strange men want him? Why were they keeping him in a cage, in this narrow cage? He did not know why, but he felt weighed down by an uneasy sense that some disaster was about to happen. Several times during the night he sprang to his feet. When the door rattled open, he expected to see the judge, or at least his boys, but each time it was the saloon keeper who looked in at him by the sickly light of the tallowed candle. And each time the joyful bark that trembled in Buck's throat was twisted into a savage growl. But the saloon keeper let him alone, and in the morning 4 men entered and picked up the crate. More torturers, Buck decided. They were evil-looking men, ragged and scruffy. Buck stormed and raged at them through the bars, but they only laughed and poked sticks at him. He attacked their sticks with his teeth until he realized that is what they wanted. So he lay down sullenly and allowed the crate to be lifted into the wagon. Then he and the crate in which he was caged began a passage through many hands. Clerks in the express office took charge of him. He was carted about in another wagon. A truck carried him with an assortment of boxes and packages onto a ferry boat. He was tucked off the steamer into a great railway depot. Finally, he was deposited into a railway car. For 2 days and nights, this railroad car was dragged along at the tail of a shrieking locomotive. For these 2 days and nights, Buck neither ate nor drank. It was his anger. He had met with the first advances of the railroad workers with a growl. They got back at him by teasing him, and when he threw himself against the bars, shaking and foaming at the mouth, they laughed at him and teased them. They growled and barked like hateful dogs, meowed like cats, and flapped their arms and crowed like chickens. It was all very silly, he knew. But therefore it was all the more offensive to his dignity, and he grew more and more angry. He did not mind the hunger so much, but he suffered greatly from the lack of water, and he became even angrier. In fact, the ill treatment had thrown him into a fever, which was fed by the soreness of the thirsty and swollen throat and tongue. He was glad for one thing. The rope was off his neck, and that had given them an unfair advantage. Now that it was off, he would show them. He was determined that they would never get another rope around his neck. For 2 days and nights he neither ate nor drank, and during those 2 days and nights of suffering, he built up so much rage that it looked very unsafe for the first person to get in his way, and his eyes turned bloodshot, and he was transformed into a raging fiend or monster. So changed was he that the judge himself would not have recognized him. The railroad workers breathed with relief when they loaded him off the train at Seattle. 4 men carrying the crate from the wagon into a small, high-walled backyard. A stout man with a red sweater that sagged at the neck came out and signed the book for the driver, top of page 8. Buck guessed that man was his next threat, and he hurled himself savagely against the bars. The man smiled grimly and brought a hatchet and a club. "You ain't gonna take him out now?" the driver asked. "Sure," replied, driving the hatchet into the crate to pry it open. There was a repeated scattering of the 4 men who carried the crate from safe perches on top of the wall. They got ready to watch the show. Buck rushed at the splintering wood, sinking his teeth into it, wrestling with it. Wherever the hatchet fell on the outside, Buck was there on the inside, snarling and growling. The man in the red sweater was calmly determined to get him out, while Buck was just as furiously anxious to get out. "Now, you red-eyed devil," he said, when he made an opening big enough for Buck's body. At the same time, he dropped the hatchet and shifted the club to his right hand. And Buck was truly a red-eyed devil. And as he drew himself together for the spring, his hair bristled, his mouth was foaming, and there was a mad glitter in his bloodshot eyes. Straight at the man he launched his 140 pounds of fury. With the built-up rage of 2 days and nights, just as his jaws were about to close on the man, he received a shock that stopped his body in midair and brought his teeth together with a painful jolt. He whirled over, hitting the ground on his back, and sighed. He had never been struck by a club in his life, and he did not understand. With a snarl that was part bark and more scream, he was once again on his feet and launched into the air. And again the shock came, and he was brought crashing to the ground. This time he was aware that it was the club, but he was too furious to be cautious. He charged 12 times, and each time the club broke the charge and smashed him down. After a particularly fierce blow, he crawled to his feet, too dazed to rush. He staggered limply. Blood flowed from his nose and his mouth and his ears. His beautiful coat was sprayed with bloody spit. Then the man advanced and deliberately dealt him a frightful blow on the nose. All the pain Buck had endured so far was nothing compared with the perfect agony of this. With a roar that was almost lion-like, he again hurled himself at the man. But the man, shifting the club from right to left, coolly caught him under the jaw, and at the same time jerked downward and backward. Buck turned a full circle in the air, and half of another circle, then crashed to the ground on his head and chest. For the last time, he rushed. The man struck the shrewd blow he had purposely held back for so long, and Buck crumpled up and went down, knocked completely senseless. "He's no slouch dog breaking, that's what I say," one of the men on the wall cried enthusiastically. "I'd rather break wild horses any day and twice on Sunday," answered the driver. He climbed on the wagon and started the horses. Buck's senses came back to him, but not his strength. He lay where he had fallen, and from there he watched the man in the red sweater. "Answers to the name Buck," the man said. He was quoting from the saloon-keeper's letter, which had announced the sending of the crate and the dog. "Well, Buck, my boy," he went on in a friendly tone, "we've had our little excitement, and the best thing we can do is to let it go at that. You've learned your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog, and all will go well. Be a bad dog, and I'll knock the stuffing out of you. Understand?" And as he spoke, he fearlessly patted the head of the dog that he had pounded so brutally. Although Buck's hair stiffened at the touch of the hand, he endured it without protest. When the man brought him water, he drank eagerly. Later, he bolted a generous meal of raw meat, chunk by chunk, from the man's hand. He was beaten, he knew that, but he was not broken. He saw once and for all that he stood no chance against a man with a club, and he had learned this lesson, and in all of his afterlife he never forgot it. The club opened his eyes. It was the introduction to the rule of the primitive law, and he met that introduction halfway. The fact of life took on a fiercer appearance. Although he faced the fierceness without fear, he faced it with all the cunning of his nature aroused. And as the days went by, other dogs came in crates and at the end of ropes. Some came tamely, and some came raging and roaring as he had come. One and all, he watched them come under the control of the man in the red sweater. Again and again, as he looked at each brutal performance, the lesson was driven home to Buck. A man with the club was a lawgiver. He was a master to be obeyed, though not necessarily to act friendly towards. Of this last, Buck was never guilty, though he did see beaten dogs that fawned upon the man, wagging their tails and licking his hand. Top of page 12. Also, he saw one dog that would neither act friendly or obey, and that dog finally was killed in the struggle of mastery. Now and again, men came strangers who talked to the man in the red sweater. Sometimes money passed between them, after which the strangers took one or more dogs with them away. Buck wondered where they went, for they never came back. But he was fearful of the future, so he was glad each time when he was not selected. Yet his time came in the end, and it was in the form of a little dried-up man. The man spat broken English, and many strange and crude words that Buck could not understand. "Skirt 'em!" he cried, when his eyes lit upon Buck. "Dat one damn bully dog, eh? How much?" 300 pounds, and a present at that, promptly replied the man in the red sweater. "And since it's government money, you ain't got no kickback coming, eh, Perrault?" Perrault grinned. It was not an unfair sum for so fine an animal, considering that the price of dogs had been pushed skyward by the great demand of them. The Canadian government would not lose on the deal. Perrault knew dogs, and when he looked at Buck, he knew that he was 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, he said. Buck saw money pass between them, and he was not surprised when Curly, a good-natured Newfoundland dog, and he were led away by the little dried-up man. That was the last he saw of the man in the red sweater. And as Curly and he looked at Seattle's growing smaller from the deck of the narwhal, it was the last he saw of the warm Southland. Curly and he were taken below by Perrault and turned over to a giant called Francois. Perrault and Francois were French-Canadian. They were a new kind of man to Buck, of which he was destined to see many more. While he developed no warm affection or feelings for them, he nevertheless grew honestly to respect them. He steadily learned that Perrault and Francois were fair men, calm and fair in administering justice, and too wise in the way of dogs to be fooled by the dogs. In the between decks of the narwhal, Buck and Curly joined two other dogs. One of them was a big snow-white fella from Spitzenberg, who had been brought away by a whaling captain and who had later accompanied a geological survey into the Barrens. He was friendly, but untrustworthy, smiling into one's face while he thought out some underhanded trick. For instance, at the first meal, he stole from Buck's food, and as Buck sprang to punish him, Francois's whip sang through the air, reaching the thief first. Nothing remained for Buck to do but to recover the bone. That was fair of Francois, Buck decided, and Francois began his rise in Buck's judgment. The other dogs made no advances, nor did he receive any. Also, he did not attempt to steal from the newcomers. He was a gloomy, brooding fellow, and he showed Curly plainly that all he wanted was to be left alone, and further, that there would be trouble if he were not left alone. He was called Dave. He ate and slept and yawned between times and took interest in nothing. He was not interested even when the narwhal crossed the Queen Charlotte Sound and rolled and pitched in Buck like a thing possessed. Buck and Curly grew excited, half wild with the fear. But Dave raised his head as though annoyed, glanced casually at them, yawned, and went back to sleep again. Day and night the ship throbbed to the tireless pulse of the propeller. Though one day was very like another, Buck could tell the weather was steadily growing colder. At last, one morning, the propeller was quiet, and the narwhal took on an air of excitement. He felt it, as did the other dogs, and knew that a change was at hand. Francois leashed them and brought them on deck, and at the first step upon the cold surface, Buck's feet sank into a white, mushy something, very much like mud. He sprang back with a snort. More of this white stuff was falling through the air. He shook himself, but more fell upon him. He sniffed it curiously, then licked some on his tongue. It bit like fire, and the next instant was gone. This puzzled him. He tried it again, with the same result. The onlookers laughed noisily, and he felt ashamed. He knew not why, for it was his first snow.